Hello. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and, well, a bit of disappointment, if I'm being honest. Tonight, we're diving into the chaotic final season of Stranger Things and exploring why it became such a disaster. I'll be covering all the major issues I can fit in for tonight, but there's definitely more to unpack than one video can handle. So, we'll start with the production troubles that plagued the season from the very beginning, the bizarre release strategy that frustrated everyone, and how the early episodes showed warning signs. Then we'll move on to the writing problems, the pacing disasters, and of course that absolutely mental finale that left fans so gutted they invented conspiracy theories about it being fake. Plenty to get talking about, but if you like what I do here and want a way to support the channel, consider subscribing down below. But for now, grab your Eggo waffles and a bit of curiosity, settle in for the upside-down truth, and let's begin. So way before the disastrous finale dropped on New Year's Eve, there were already massive red flags waving about Season 5. And I mean proper warning signs that anyone paying attention could have spotted from miles away. The gap between Season 4 and Season 5 was absolutely mental. We're talking about 3 full years. Season 4 wrapped up in July 2022, and Season 5 didn't start airing until November 2025. For a show about teenagers, that's an eternity. The cast had literally aged out of their roles whilst waiting to finish the story. Now, to be fair, a lot of that delay wasn't the Duffers' fault. The 2023 Hollywood strikes brought basically everything to a standstill. Both the Writers Guild of America and SAG-AFTRA went on strike, and production on pretty much every major show and film just stopped. These strikes were necessary and important for workers' rights, so I'm not saying they were a bad thing, but they absolutely wreaked havoc on Stranger Things' already complicated timeline. What's really interesting is that the Duffers had actually outlined the entire 5th season before Season 4 even started filming. According to interviews, they knew exactly how the show was going to end. They'd planned it all out in detail, which is pretty unusual for them, since they typically write as they go along. The COVID-19 pandemic had given them extra time to map everything out, so they had this complete roadmap ready to go, but here's where things get weird. After Season 4 came out, and they saw the fan reaction, the Duffers decided to completely rework the ending. They went back and changed major plot points, and even altered how the series would conclude. On one hand, it shows they were listening to feedback. On the other hand, it meant throwing out a carefully planned ending and scrambling to create something new under pressure. Production finally began on January 8th, 2024, after all the strikes were resolved. But even then, the chaos didn't stop. The cast and crew were dealing with scheduling nightmares because everyone had moved on to other projects during the delay. David Harbour, who plays Hopper, had originally expected to film Stranger Things at the same time as his Marvel film Thunderbolts, but the strikes pushed everything around. Winona Ryder had to squeeze in Beetlejuice during the gap, though thankfully that worked out since the Duffers had promised her, years ago, she could take time off for a sequel if Tim Burton ever made one. The table read for Episode 4 happened on December 6th, 2023, which sounds early, but it shows just how long this process dragged on. The final table read didn't occur until September 8th, 2024, nearly a year later. That's almost an entire year of table reads alone, and apparently the cast didn't even know how the show ended until that final read because the Duffers don't typically share scripts in advance. Fun fact, there were also some behind-the-scenes director changes that raised eyebrows. Dan Trachtenberg, who directed Prey and 10 Cloverfield Lane, had been hired to helm an episode. People were quite excited about this since Trachtenberg is known for tight, suspenseful storytelling. But then he got tapped to direct Predator, Badlands after that film was greenlit, and he had to drop out of Stranger Things. His episode ended up being directed by Frank Darabont instead, the guy behind The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. Sounds impressive, right? But Darabont hadn't directed much recently, and the shift in directorial vision mid-season definitely didn't help maintain consistency. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, The cast aging issue. When Stranger Things started in 2016, the core kids were actually kids. Finn Wolfhard was 13, Millie Bobby Brown was 12, Gaten Matarazzo was 13. By the time they finished filming season 5 in 2024, they were in their early 20s. That's fine for playing older teenagers, but the show was supposed to be set in 1987, just a year or so after season 4. These characters were meant to be 15 or 16, not adults pushing 21 or 22. The show tried to work around this with makeup and wardrobe, but honestly, it was obvious. Noah Schnapp, who plays Will, looked like a proper adult trying to pass as a high schooler. It created this weird disconnect where you're watching what's supposed to be a coming-of-age story about kids, but you're actually watching adults pretend to be kids. The emotional beats that might have landed when they were younger just hit differently when you're watching someone who could legally drink in America playing a sophomore. There's also the budget situation, which is a whole thing on its own. Netflix was pouring absolutely obscene amounts of money into this final season. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars across the whole production. Season 1 had been made for roughly $6 million per episode, which was already pretty generous for a streaming show at the time. By season 5, reports suggested the budget had ballooned to something like $30 million per episode, maybe more. You'd think that kind of money would guarantee quality, but it doesn't work that way. Sometimes having too much money is actually worse than having constraints. When the Duffers made season 1, they had to be creative with their limited resources. They couldn't rely on massive CGI battles or elaborate set pieces, so they focused on atmosphere, character, and tension. By season 5, they could afford anything they wanted, and it shows. The season is bloated with expensive-looking sequences that don't actually serve the story. The 3-year gap also meant that the cultural landscape had completely shifted. When season 4 came out in 2022, Stranger Things was still riding high as one of Netflix's crown jewels. By 2025, the streaming wars had intensified. Netflix was in a different financial position, and audience tastes had evolved. The show that had felt fresh and exciting in 2016 was now competing with a saturated market of nostalgia-driven content. And here's something that really gets me. The Duffers have said in interviews that they always knew season 5 would be the end. They'd planned for 5 seasons from early on. But the delays meant they were trying to stick the landing on a show that had already overstayed its welcome by a year or two. The momentum from season 4's cliffhanger had completely evaporated by the time season 5 arrived. People had moved on, found other shows, and the feverish anticipation had cooled to mild curiosity for a lot of viewers. There were also rumours, never fully confirmed, about creative disagreements behind the scenes. The Duffers are notoriously protective of their vision, which is generally a good thing for maintaining consistency. But when you're this deep into a show with this much money on the line and this many stakeholders, that kind of creative stubbornness can become a liability. Netflix wanted certain things, the Duffers wanted other things, and somewhere in that tug-of-war, the actual quality of the storytelling seemed to get lost. All of this behind-the-scenes chaos, it absolutely showed in the final product. You can feel the years of delay in how the season moves. You can sense the rewrites in plot threads that go nowhere. You can see the budget excess in effect sequences that look expensive but feel hollow. And you can tell the cast had outgrown their roles in nearly every frame. The warning signs were there from the very beginning. A 3-year gap, massive rewrites, director changes, scheduling chaos, a cast that had aged out of their parts, and a production that seemed more concerned with scale than substance. Anyone could have predicted this wasn't going to end well. Now, let's talk about one of the strangest decisions Netflix has ever made with a major series. And trust me, they've made some properly bizarre calls over the years, but this one takes the cake. Instead of dropping the entire final season at once like they'd done with every previous season, or even splitting it into 2 parts like they did with season 4, Netflix decided to release season 5 in 3 separate volumes across the holiday season. 3 different release dates, 3 separate events, 3 opportunities for things to go wrong. Volume 1, containing episodes 1 through 4, dropped on November 26th, 2025. That's the day before Thanksgiving in the US, which seems strategic enough. Get people watching over the long holiday weekend, create buzz, all that. Then Volume 2, with episodes 5 through 7, came out on Christmas Day, December 25th. And finally, the series finale, just one single episode, arrived on New Year's Eve, December 31st. I mean, what kind of release strategy is that? You're making people wait a month between the first batch and the second, then less than a week between the second batch and the finale. The pacing of it makes absolutely no sense. It's like Netflix couldn't decide if they wanted to create event television or just get it over with. The timing was also mental when you think about it. They were essentially competing with the holidays for people's attention. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Eve are times when people are with family, travelling, eating too much, or recovering from eating too much. They're not necessarily sitting down for hours to watch a dark sci-fi show about monsters and government conspiracies. Each volume released at 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is 8 p.m. Eastern. This was different from Netflix's usual midnight releases, and apparently it was meant to make the drops feel more like live events. The idea was that people could watch together in real time, rather than waking up to find new episodes already available. In practice, it just meant people on the West Coast had to avoid spoilers all day, whilst those on the East Coast were already watching. Fun fact, Netflix actually increased their bandwidth by 30% in preparation for the Season 5 premiere because they were expecting massive traffic. And you know what happened? The site crashed anyway. Shortly after Volume 1 went live, Netflix experienced significant slowdowns and outages. People couldn't log in, streams were buffering, and social media erupted with complaints. For a company that had been doing this for over a decade, it was a bit embarrassing. Then it happened again with the finale. When that final episode dropped on New Year's Eve, Netflix crashed once more. You'd think they would have learned from the first time, but apparently not. It's not exactly the way you want to send off your biggest show. The volume strategy also completely killed any momentum the season might have built. With a traditional binge release, viewers can power through the entire story in a weekend if they want. The narrative flow stays intact, the emotional beats connect, and you're fully immersed in the world. With this staggered approach, you watch 4 episodes, then you wait a month. By the time the next batch arrives, you've half forgotten what happened. You have to spend the first episode of Volume 2 remembering where everyone was and what they were doing. It's worth noting that Netflix did try to frame this as a special event. They marketed each volume drop as its own premiere, with red carpet events for Volume 1 and a limited theatrical release for the finale in select US and Canadian cities. The finale screenings ran from December 31st through January 1st, 2026, giving fans the option to see the series end on the big screen. That's actually quite cool in theory. Watching the finale in a theatre with other fans could have been a brilliant communal experience. In practice, though, the limited number of theatres meant most people couldn't access it even if they wanted to. And by all accounts, the theatrical screenings didn't sell out or create the cultural moment Netflix was hoping for. What's really interesting is comparing this to how Season 4 was released. That season got split into 2 volumes as well, but they were only 5 weeks apart, and each volume was substantial. Volume 1 had 7 episodes, Volume 2 had 2, but those 2 episodes were feature length. The strategy there felt more considered, more deliberate. With Season 5, it felt like Netflix was throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. The 3-volume approach also meant 3 separate waves of reviews and reactions. Volume 1 got decent enough reception initially. People were cautiously optimistic. Then Volume 2 dropped, and the backlash began. By the time the finale arrived, the discourse was already deeply negative. If they'd released it all at once, maybe the stronger moments could have balanced out the weaker ones in people's minds. Instead, we got this drawn-out process where each new batch seemed to make things worse. According to Netflix's own data, Season 5 Volume 1 pulled in about 59.6 million global views in its first 5 days. That made it the biggest premiere ever for an English-language series on Netflix and one of the largest debuts in the platform's history. Massive numbers, undeniably. But I wonder how many of those viewers actually stuck around for Volumes 2 and 3 after the initial excitement wore off. The release strategy was messy, frustrating, and felt like Netflix was prioritizing their own metrics over the actual viewing experience. But at least people were watching, even if they were increasingly annoyed about having to wait. The real question was whether they were enjoying what they saw. So Volume 1 dropped on November 26th. And honestly, it wasn't terrible. I know that sounds like damning with faint praise, but after everything I've just said about the production troubles, I was genuinely relieved the first 4 episodes were watchable. The season premiere, titled, quote, Zero, was described by Ross Duffer as the most eventful episode in the entire series, and he wasn't completely wrong. It throws you straight back into the action with Hawkins under military quarantine, rifts tearing through the town, and the gang trying to figure out where Vecna's disappeared to. There's a lot happening, maybe too much, but it's engaging enough to pull you back in after 3 years away. Episode 2 had this whole mystery around its title for ages. On Netflix's episode list, it just said Chapter 2, The Vanishing of, with the rest cut off. People were speculating like mad about what had vanished, and when the episode finally played, the opening credits revealed it was The Vanishing of Holly Wheeler. Mike and Nancy's little sister getting pulled into the upside-down stuff was actually quite a bold move. Holly had been basically a background character for 4 seasons, so giving her a major role felt fresh. The second episode also had what Ross Duffer called the, quote, 3 they'd ever done, and it was properly intense. I won't spoil exactly what happens in case anyone reading this still hasn't watched, but it involves a sudden attack that shifts the entire dynamic of the season. The Duffers know how to craft a shocking opening sequence. I'll give them that. Episode 3 continued building the tension, with Will Byers finally coming into his own a bit. We'd spent 4 seasons watching Will be the victim, the one who gets possessed or targeted or left behind. In Volume 1, he starts to gain actual agency and even develops powers connected to his history with the Upside Down. It's about bloody time, honestly. Noah Schnapp had been underutilized for years. But Episode 4 is where Volume 1 really peaked. This was the mid-season finale before the Christmas break, and the Duffers pulled out all the stops. It's 81 minutes long, basically a feature film, and a massive chunk of that runtime is dedicated to an absolutely bonkers battle sequence. The military, the Hawkins crew, and a horde of creatures from the Upside Down all collide in this chaotic fight at the Wheeler house and around town. The action choreography was genuinely impressive. You had Eleven and Hopper fighting together, Steve wielding a nail bat like always, and this overwhelming sense of everything falling apart. It felt like the show at its best, this perfect blend of character moments and blockbuster spectacle. If the entire season had maintained that energy and focus, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. According to critics who reviewed Volume 1, the reception was cautiously positive. Rotten Tomatoes had the season sitting in the 70s initially, which isn't amazing, but it's respectable. The BBC said fans wouldn't go away disappointed from these episodes, and that anticipation for the rest was at fever pitch. The Daily Beast mentioned the show hadn't lost a step in terms of vibrant personality and horror spectacle. NPR praised the Duffer Brothers for finding a newly beguiling, action-packed way to lead viewers down a familiar road. To be fair, there were also critics pointing out problems even in Volume 1. The Independent noted the season lacked contrast and emotional heart compared to earlier years. It was all teeth-baring and chasing, without enough quieter moments to let characters breathe. Some reviews mentioned the episodes felt a bit bloated, that the lengthy runtimes weren't always justified by the content, and there were definitely structural issues you could spot if you were paying attention. The show has accumulated so many characters over 5 seasons that it's become nearly impossible to give everyone meaningful screen time. Mike and Will, who should be central to the story, kept getting sidelined in favour of newer additions or secondary plot lines. Lucas had barely anything to do. Dustin was mostly comic relief. The core group that made Season 1 so special felt diluted and fragmented. The pacing in episodes 1 and 2 was also a bit choppy. They'd build momentum, then suddenly cut to a different storyline and lose it. There were these long exposition dumps where characters would sit around explaining the situation to each other, which was clearly meant to catch up viewers who might not remember every detail from 3 years ago, but it often felt like the show was stalling, treading water before getting to the good stuff. Fun fact, Volume 1 also introduced us properly to Dr. K, played by the legendary Linda Hamilton. She was set up as this new antagonist hunting Eleven for the government, and people were quite excited about Hamilton bringing her Terminator energy to the show. We'll talk more about how that character was used later, but her introduction in Volume 1 was suitably menacing and mysterious. What really struck me about these first 4 episodes was how much they relied on nostalgia and callbacks. There were constant references to earlier seasons, visual echoes of iconic moments, and a general sense that the show was looking backward rather than forward. That's not inherently bad for a final season. You want to honour what came before. But it sometimes felt like the Duffers were more interested in reminding you why you loved Stranger Things than in telling a new story worth loving on its own merits. The writing was already showing some of the problems that would plague the rest of the season. Characters were starting to over-explain things, narrating their emotions and plans in ways that felt unnatural. The dialogue lacked the snappy, authentic feel of earlier seasons. Everyone sounded a bit too polished, too scripted, like they were reading lines rather than talking to each other. But despite all these issues, Volume 1 worked well enough to keep people invested. The cliffhanger at the end of Episode 4 was genuinely shocking and set up some massive questions for Volume 2. Holly was trapped in a nightmarish version of Hawkins, Eleven was on the run, and Vecna's plan was starting to reveal itself in terrifying ways. Social media was buzzing with theories. People were dissecting every frame, debating what would happen next, creating elaborate predictions about the finale. The fandom was engaged and excited. There was genuine hope that the Duffers would stick the landing, that all the setup and spectacle would pay off in a satisfying conclusion. Volume 1 left us with hope. Foolish, foolish hope. Fast forward to Christmas Day, and that's when everything really started going wrong. If Volume 1 was a warning sign, Volume 2 was a 5-alarm fire. The 3 episodes that dropped on December 25th, 2025, managed to take all the goodwill the first batch had generated and set it ablaze in spectacular fashion. Episode 5, titled Shock Jock, ran for 68 minutes and kicked off with some promise. There's a radio station subplot that gives the episode its name, and it's actually kind of clever. The problem is that the episode spends so much time setting up various plot threads that barely anything actually happens. Characters move from location to location, have conversations that rehash information we already know, and the whole thing just feels like it's spinning its wheels whilst waiting for the real story to begin. Episode 6, Tux Quote Fi, is the shortest of Volume 2 at just 58 minutes. This is the one where Eleven, Carly and Max are trying to rescue the kidnapped children from this nightmare dimension. The concept is brilliant, the execution less so. There are some genuinely creepy moments, and seeing Carly again was nice, since she'd been absent since that universally hated Season 2 episode. But the pacing is all over the place, and the emotional beats that should land just sort of thud. Then we get to Episode 7, The Bridge, which clocks in at a whopping 97 minutes. This is the episode that absolutely destroyed the season's reputation and sparked the most controversy. We'll get into the specifics in a moment, but just know that this single episode caused Stranger Things' Rotten Tomatoes audience score to plummet from the 70s all the way down to 56%. That's the lowest score the show has ever received by a massive margin. For context, Season 1 sits at 96%. Season 2 at 90%, Season 3 at 86%, and even Season 4 managed 89%. The immediate reaction to Volume 2 was visceral and negative. People weren't just disappointed, they were angry, confused, and in some cases properly furious about what they'd watched. Social media erupted with complaints. Reddit threads dissecting everything wrong with these episodes hit thousands of comments. The discourse shifted from excited speculation to bitter criticism almost overnight. So what went so catastrophically wrong? Let's start with the pacing, which ground to an absolute halt across all 3 episodes. Volume 1 had its issues, but at least things were happening. Volume 2 feels like the Duffers forgot they were telling a story, and instead decided to have characters stand around explaining the plot to each other for hours. There are these incredibly long scenes where groups of characters will gather and someone will lay out their entire plan in excruciating detail. Then another character will repeat that plan back to them to make sure everyone understands. Then they'll discuss potential problems with the plan. Then they'll reassure each other about the plan. And the audience is sitting there screaming at the screen because we understood the plan the first time it was explained, and now we've heard it 4 more times. Roger Ebert's website described this as the quote 7, where shows are written to be half-watched whilst you're folding laundry or scrolling on your phone. The dialogue becomes overly explanatory because the creators assume you're not paying full attention. But Stranger Things used to demand your attention. It used to trust its audience to keep up. This felt like a completely different show, one that had no faith in viewers' intelligence or engagement. The exposition dumps were relentless. Characters would literally narrate their emotions and motivations out loud. I'm doing this because I'm afraid of losing you, instead of showing that fear through action. We need to stick together as a family, instead of demonstrating familial bonds through behaviour. Everything was stated, nothing was implied, and it sucked all the subtlety and nuance out of the storytelling. Even the structure of scenes became repetitive and boring. Someone would propose doing something dangerous. Another character would object. They'd argue for a bit. Someone would give an inspirational speech. Everyone would agree to do the dangerous thing. Repeat this formula 10 or 15 times across 3 episodes, and you've got Volume 2. But the elephant in the room, the thing that dominated all conversation about Volume 2, was Will Byers' coming out scene in Episode 7. And this is where we need to tread carefully, because the discourse around this moment has been an absolute mess of legitimate criticism mixed with bad faith bigotry. Here's what actually happens in the episode. The gang is preparing for a major confrontation with Vecna, and they're all gathered together, having what's meant to be an emotional moment of unity. Will gives this lengthy monologue where he comes out to his friends, explaining that he's gay and that he struggled with his identity whilst dealing with all the upside-down trauma. Now, Will being gay is not a surprise. The show has been hinting at this since literally the first season. His sexuality has been subtly coded throughout the entire run. Noah Schnapp himself came out publicly in 2023, and he's talked about how Will's journey mirrors his own. So the revelation itself isn't the problem. The problem is how it's executed. The scene runs for several minutes, and it's this very on-the-nose, very explicit monologue where Will spells out exactly how he feels and what he's been going through. There's no subtlety, no trust that the audience has picked up on the years of subtext. It feels less like a character moment and more like the writers ticking a box. USA Today pointed out how odd the scene felt, noting that Will has never really developed much as a character beyond being a victim, and this moment ends up feeling underwhelming and awkward rather than triumphant and inspirational. Variety's Daniel Diodario said it struck an emotional chord and felt seismic, but even positive reviews acknowledged the clunky execution. The timing also felt strange to many viewers. You're in the penultimate episode of the entire series, gearing up for the final battle, and suddenly everything stops for this extended coming out speech. The dramatic momentum just evaporates. It's not that the moment doesn't deserve time and attention. It absolutely does. But the placement feels off, like it was inserted because the writers realised they were running out of time to address it, rather than because it naturally fit into the story at that point. What happened next was predictable and depressing. The episode got review bombed on IMDb, with its score plummeting to 5.4 out of 10. That makes it the lowest rated episode of Stranger Things ever by a significant margin. Most episodes sit between 8.6 and 9.2, and The Bridge is the only one below a 7.8. More than 96,000 users reviewed it, whilst most other episodes this season got fewer than 50,000 reviews. The numbers alone tell you something coordinated was happening. Elon Musk, because of course he did, weighed in on Twitter claiming the show had gone woke and that it was completely unnecessary and forced on audiences who just want to enjoy some basic sci-fi. His tweet got millions of views and emboldened the worst elements of the fanbase to flood review sites with homophobic garbage. But here's the thing, and this is important. Not everyone criticising the scene was being bigoted. Plenty of LGBTQ+ viewers and allies had legitimate issues with how the moment was written and placed. The criticism wasn't about Will being gay. It was about the execution feeling clumsy and the dialogue being overly expository and the timing disrupting the narrative flow. One person on social media said they loved the very gay sports romance, heated rivalry, but found Will's scene awkward because it felt shoehorned into a plot that didn't have room for it. Another gay viewer talked about how they appreciated the representation, but wished it had been handled with more care and integration into the overall story. The tragedy is that all the nuanced criticism got drowned out by the review bombing and the culture war nonsense. You couldn't have a genuine conversation about the writing choices, because everything devolved into people screaming about wokeness or defending the scene as perfect and above criticism. Episode 7 became the lightning rod for all of Season 5's problems. The pacing issues, the exposition dumps, the lack of meaningful stakes, the sense that characters were just going through motions, all of it crystallized around this one episode and this one scene. By the time Volume 2 ended, the fandom was fractured, and the critical consensus had shifted from cautiously optimistic to deeply concerned. We had one episode left, one final chance for the Duffers to pull off a miracle and redeem the season. Spoiler alert, they didn't. On New Year's Eve 2025, after 10 years of build-up, Stranger Things ended with a whimper instead of a bang. The series finale, titled The Right Side Up, dropped at 8 p.m. Eastern on December 31st, running for just over 2 hours. Netflix had hyped it as a cinematic event, even arranging limited theatrical screenings in select cities across the US and Canada. Fans gathered in living rooms and movie theatres, ready for an epic conclusion to a decade-long journey. What they got instead was a muddled, anticlimactic mess that somehow managed to be both overstuffed and underwhelming at the same time. The episode is structured in 3 distinct acts, and honestly, they feel like 3 completely different episodes stitched together. You've got the preparation phase, where everyone gets ready for the final battle. Then you've got the actual confrontation with Vecna and the Mind Flayer. And finally, there's this extended epilogue set 18 months later that takes up nearly 40 minutes of the runtime. It's a bizarre structure that never quite gels into a coherent whole. Let's start with the first act, which is primarily characters running around making final preparations. There are obligatory scenes of people saying goodbye in case they don't make it back, characters reconciling past differences, and lots of gearing up with weapons and supplies. It's all very paint by numbers, hitting emotional beats that feel more like obligations than genuine moments. The Duffers seem to think that having 2 characters walk slowly whilst discussing their feelings automatically creates depth, but it just comes across as padding. Steve and Nancy have a conversation. Hopper and Eleven have a conversation. Mike and Will have a conversation. Jonathan and Joyce have a conversation. None of these exchanges reveal anything we don't already know or add anything meaningful to the characters. They're just filling time before the action starts. There's this moment where Hopper gives this speech to Eleven about how life has been unfair to her, how her childhood was stolen, how she's been attacked and manipulated by terrible people. It's meant to be this powerful emotional beat, but David Harbour is essentially narrating Eleven's entire character arc back to her and to the audience. We've watched this happen over 5 seasons. We don't need it explained again. Then we finally get to the battle, and this is where things get properly messy. The plan is to split into groups. One team goes into the abyss to fight Vecna directly, whilst Eleven, Carly, and a newly awakened Max rescue the kidnapped children from Camazotz. Meanwhile, other characters are dealing with the military presence in Hawkins and trying to keep the rifts from expanding further. The action itself is fine. There are explosions, creatures attacking, telekinetic battles, all the expensive CGI you'd expect from a show with this budget. But it lacks any real tension or stakes because you never believe for a second that any of the main characters are in actual danger. The show has spent 5 seasons protecting its core cast with impenetrable plot armor, and nothing in this finale suggests that's about to change. Steve nearly falls from a tower at one point, and there's this brief moment where it seems like he might actually die. But then he grabs onto something at the last second and pulls himself up. Of course he does. Hopper gets surrounded by demogorgons, and it looks bad for about 10 seconds before Eleven shows up to save him. Naturally, the show keeps manufacturing these fake-out deaths that fool absolutely no one. What's really frustrating is how quickly Vecna gets defeated. This is the villain who's been built up since Season 4 as this terrifying, nearly unstoppable force. He's killed multiple people, opened rifts between dimensions, and orchestrated an entire apocalyptic scenario. In the finale, Joyce Byers walks up to him and chops his head off with an axe. That's it. That's how the main antagonist goes down. I mean, it's a cool visual, and I'm always here for Winona Ryder getting a badass moment. But it happens so suddenly, and with so little struggle, that it feels completely anticlimactic. There's no extended battle, no clever strategy that takes advantage of everything we've learned about Vecna over the season, just Joyce going full Thor and aiming for the head. The fight is over in minutes after 7 episodes of setup. Then there's the Mind Flayer situation, which is somehow even more underwhelming. It gets revealed that the Mind Flayer has actually been the power behind Vecna all along, that Henry Creel was manipulated into becoming the villain we know. This is presented as this major twist, but it doesn't really land because we've barely seen the Mind Flayer this season. It's been lurking in the background, and suddenly it's supposed to be the real big bad. The gang fights a giant CGI monster that looks expensive but never feels particularly threatening. Characters shoot at it with flamethrowers and guns, which apparently work fine even though Demogorgons and Vecna have been shown to be resistant to conventional weapons throughout the series. The inconsistency is maddening. Why would the Mind Flayer, supposedly the most powerful entity in the Upside Down, be vulnerable to the same weapons that barely scratched its underlings? And speaking of the Demogorgons, where the bloody hell were they during all this? The finale has Vecna and the Mind Flayer as the only major threats, but we've spent 4 seasons establishing that the Upside Down is crawling with Demogorgons, Demobats, Demodogs, and all manner of horrifying creatures. They're just completely absent from the final battle. Fans on social media were properly confused about this, asking why the climax felt so empty of the monsters that have defined the show's horror elements. One person on Twitter wrote, quote 14, and honestly, it's a fair question. Did they all just take the day off? Did Vecna decide he didn't need backup? It makes the final confrontation feel smaller and less consequential than battles we've seen in previous seasons. Then we get to Eleven's sacrifice, which is meant to be the emotional climax of the entire series. She realizes the only way to permanently seal the rifts and destroy the connection between dimensions is to trap herself in the Upside Down. So she does exactly that. saying goodbye to Hopper and her friends before walking into the portal and sealing it behind her. It's played as this devastating moment of heroism and loss. Millie Bobby Brown gives it her all, and the scene is genuinely emotional if you can ignore all the problems surrounding it. But then the Duffers completely undercut their own moment by making Eleven's fate ambiguous. After the epilogue time jump, we see Mike theorizing that Eleven might not actually be dead. He suggests she could have used her powers to escape to another dimension, that she might be alive somewhere out there. The show never confirms or denies this. It just leaves it open to interpretation, letting viewers decide for themselves whether she survived or not. According to the Duffers, in their post-finale interviews with Variety, they deliberately left this ambiguous so fans could choose what to believe. Ross Duffer said the show had grown so massive with so many fan theories that they wanted to give people the freedom to decide certain things for themselves. It's a nice idea in principle, but in execution, it just feels like they couldn't commit to an actual ending. Ambiguity can be powerful when it's purposeful and thematically resonant. This just feels like hedging. The Duffers wanted to have their cake and eat it too, to get credit for a tragic sacrifice without actually following through on it. It's the ultimate example of the show's refusal to take real risks or make difficult choices. The only significant death in the entire finale is Carly, Eleven's quote 15, from the universally disliked Season 2 episode. Quote 16, she dies helping Eleven in the Camazotz rescue mission, and it's treated as this meaningful sacrifice. But Carly has barely been in the show. She appeared in one episode everyone hated, made a brief return this season, and now she's gone. Her death doesn't carry any emotional weight because we never got to know her as a character. Then there's Dr. K, played by Linda Hamilton, who is absolutely wasted in this finale. She's been set up all season as this formidable antagonist hunting Eleven for the government. Hamilton brings her considerable talent and gravitas to the role, and the character had so much potential. In the finale, she just sort of disappears. She's sidelined during the climactic moments, and the show never bothers to give her arc any real resolution. It's borderline criminal to cast someone of Hamilton's caliber and then do basically nothing with her. After all the battles are won and the day is saved, we jump forward 18 months to see where everyone ended up. This epilogue section takes up a massive chunk of the finale's runtime, nearly 40 minutes, and it's genuinely the best part of the episode. When the show slows down and focuses on character moments instead of expensive action sequences, it remembers what made it special in the first place. We see that Hawkins has returned to normal, or as normal as it can be after everything that's happened. The military has pulled out, the rifts are sealed, life has moved on. The kids are now graduating high school, which raises its own set of questions, but we'll get to that in a moment. Steve has become a baseball coach and sex education teacher, which is a perfect ending for his character, honestly. He's found purpose in helping kids, using all the babysitting experience he gained over 5 seasons. Nancy, Jonathan, and Robin have all moved away to pursue their own paths. Hopper finally gets his romantic dinner with Joyce at Enzo's and proposes to her. These are sweet, well-earned moments that actually feel true to the characters. The graduation ceremony gives us Dustin as valedictorian delivering a chaotic speech about defying conformity, which is both funny and thematically appropriate. Then we get the final scene, which is the original gang, Mike, Will, Lucas, and Dustin, back in Mike's basement playing Dungeons and Dragons, just like they did in the very first episode. This callback is obviously intentional and meant to bring the story full circle. They're in the same place doing the same thing, but they've all grown and changed. It's meant to be bittersweet and nostalgic, and for a lot of viewers, this scene worked. It reminded them why they fell in love with these characters in the first place. But there's also something about it that feels a bit too neat, a bit too safe. Max makes a comment during the game about the ending being trite, about comfort and happiness being a boring way to conclude an epic campaign. And you can't help but feel like that's the Duffers commenting on their own finale. acknowledging its conventionality while simultaneously asking us to accept it. Fun fact, this meta-commentary about the ending being too trite is what sparked a lot of the conformity gate conspiracy theories we'll talk about later. Some fans took it as evidence that the whole epilogue was fake, that Max was breaking character, to hint that none of this was real. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There are also some proper continuity errors in this epilogue that people picked up on immediately. Max somehow graduated with her class despite being in a coma for nearly 2 years. How does that work? Did she take correspondence courses whilst unconscious? It's a small thing, but it's the kind of detail that breaks immersion when you notice it. The finale isn't unwatchable. There are moments of genuine emotion, and the epilogue proves the Duffers can still craft satisfying character beats when they want to. But as a conclusion to 10 years of storytelling, it's deeply disappointing. It's safe when it should be bold, vague when it should be definitive, and bloated when it should be focused. After 2 hours, the credits roll, and you're left with this hollow feeling of, is that it? Is that really how it ends? Now here's where things get properly mental. Within hours of the finale airing, a subset of the fan base decided that what they'd just watched wasn't actually the real ending. They convinced themselves that the Duffer brothers had pulled off an elaborate fake-out, that the finale's 40-minute epilogue was actually a Vecna-induced illusion, and that the true series finale would drop a week later on January 7th, 2026. This theory, dubbed Conformity Gate by its adherents, spread like wildfire across TikTok, Reddit, and Twitter. People started combing through every frame of the finale, looking for evidence to support their belief that they'd been tricked. And honestly, they found quite a lot of supposed clues, though whether any of them actually mean anything is another matter entirely. The name Out-20 comes from the epilogue's central theme. During the final Dungeons & Dragons game, the characters talk about defying conformity and choosing your own path. Dustin's graduation speech is all about not conforming to expectations. Fans latched onto this and argued that the entire ending was too conformist, too conventional, too safe to be what the Duffers actually wanted. Therefore, it must be fake. The theory goes like this. Vecna wasn't actually defeated when Joyce chopped his head off. Instead, he won. He successfully merged Dimension X with Earth and trapped everyone in an illusion where they think they've won and everything's fine. The whole epilogue, the graduation, the happy endings, all of it is just Vecna's final manipulation. The real finale would show them breaking free from the illusion and facing the actual consequences. I mean, it's a creative interpretation, I'll give them that. But the evidence they point to is mostly just continuity errors and normal filmmaking choices that they've decided are intentional clues. One of the biggest pieces of evidence involves the spines of Dungeons & Dragons books visible in Mike's basement during the final scene. If you look at the letters on the spines and read them in a very specific order, skipping certain books and squinting a bit, you can supposedly spell out quote 22. Fans took this to mean Dimension X is a lie, that they're still trapped in it. To be fair, the books are arranged in a weird way that does kind of spell something if you're looking for it, but it's also just as likely that the set decorators put books on a shelf without thinking about what conspiracy theorists would read into the spines. Occam's razor suggests the simpler explanation is probably correct. Another bit of evidence involves props changing colours between scenes. Specifically, there's this voltage dial that appears in different shots, and some fans noticed it looks different in the epilogue sections compared to earlier in the episode. They argue this mirrors how Vecna's illusions, in previous episodes, would have small visual tells, little inconsistencies that clued people in that something wasn't real. Holly Wheeler had learned to spot these inconsistencies when she was trapped in Vecna's nightmare version of Hawkins earlier in the season. So the theory goes that these colour changes are intentional signals that we're now in another illusion. Again, it's creative, but it's also just as likely to be a continuity error or different lighting setups between filming days. There's also the positioning of characters during certain shots. Some fans created elaborate diagrams showing how characters stand or move in the epilogue, claiming their positions mirror how Henry Creel/Vecna would stand or pose. Apparently, this is meant to be another clue that he's controlling everything. I've looked at these comparisons, and honestly, people are reaching quite hard. Turns out humans only have so many ways to stand around in a room. Mike rolling a 7 during the final D&D game became another major piece of evidence. In the show's very first episode, Mike rolled a 7 and it was significant to the plot. Fans decided that Mike rolling another 7 in the finale was too coincidental, that it must be a sign the story was looping back on itself, trapped in Vecna's illusion. Or, it could just be a nice callback to the pilot. Those are also allowed in television. What's really interesting is how Max's dialogue during that D&D game fueled the conspiracy. When Mike describes the ending of their campaign, Max says, quote 23, "It's clearly the Duffers being self-aware about their own ending, maybe even inviting criticism of it. But Conformity Gate believers took it as Max breaking character, as the actress or the show itself telling us this ending is fake because it's too trite." There was even this freeze frame that went viral showing an extra in the background of the graduation scene, holding a blank protest sign with nothing written on it. Fans insisted this was intentional, that the blank sign represented the emptiness of the illusion or something equally symbolic. More likely, it's just a background extra whose sign hadn't been filled in or was meant to be out of focus anyway. A Change.org petition demanding Netflix release quote 24 gathered over 400,000 signatures. 400,000 people signed a petition based on a conspiracy theory. That's absolutely mental, but it shows just how desperate fans were for a better ending than what they got. The theory predicted that the real Episode 9 would drop on January 7th, 2026, exactly 1 week after the fake finale. Fans had convinced themselves this was happening. They analysed Netflix's release patterns, looked for hidden messages in promotional materials, and built this elaborate case for why it made perfect sense. January 7th came and went. Nothing happened. No secret episode, no surprise announcement. Just silence from Netflix and the Duffers. Some believers shifted the goalposts, claiming the real finale would actually come out on January 12th alongside the Tut Quote 26 documentary. That date also passed with nothing. At some point, you have to accept reality. Netflix's only real response was changing their Instagram bio to say, "All episodes of Stranger Things are now playing," in all caps, which was about as close to a denial as they were willing to give. The Duffers addressed it more directly in their Variety interview, with Matt Duffer saying, "The show has just grown so massive. Online there's just so much misinformation. We would be here for hours trying to bat down the stuff that was not true. But at the end of the day, hopefully the work speaks for itself." Basically, there is no secret ending. What you saw is what you got. But Conformity Gate tells us something important about Season 5's failure. Fans were so disappointed, so unsatisfied with the actual ending, that they invented an elaborate conspiracy theory rather than accept it. They wanted so badly for there to be something more, something better, that they convinced themselves the Duffers couldn't possibly have intended that finale to be the real conclusion. It's a bit sad, honestly. These are people who loved Stranger Things so much that the idea of it ending poorly was literally unacceptable to them. They had to believe there was a secret masterpiece waiting to be revealed because the alternative, that the show they'd invested a decade in had fumbled its landing, was too painful. Conformity Gate showed just how desperate fans were for a better ending than what they got. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. The writing this season was, to put it mildly, a mess. I've been dancing around this issue whilst discussing other problems, but it's time to address it head on. The dialogue, the characterization, the narrative structure, all of it represents a massive decline from what made Stranger Things special in the first place. And honestly, it's the kind of decline that makes you wonder if anyone was actually reading these scripts before they started filming. The most glaring problem is the over-explanation epidemic that plagues every single episode. Characters don't just do things anymore. They announce what they're going to do, explain why they're going to do it, discuss the potential consequences of doing it, and then narrate their actions whilst they're doing it. It's exhausting. There's this scene in episode 5 where the group is planning to infiltrate a government facility. They sit around a table for what feels like 10 minutes while someone draws out the entire plan on a map, explaining each step in excruciating detail. Then another character repeats the plan back to make sure everyone understands. Then they discuss what could go wrong. Then they reassure each other. By the time they actually execute the plan, you've heard it described so many times that watching it happen is just tedious. This happens over and over again throughout the season. Every plan gets explained multiple times. Every emotion gets stated explicitly. Every relationship dynamic gets verbalized rather than shown. The Duffers seem to have completely lost faith in their audience's ability to understand subtext or follow a plot without having it spelled out in capital letters. According to the Roger Ebert website's review, this is the quote 20 disastrous, where shows are written to be watchable whilst you're folding laundry or putting away Christmas gifts. The dialogue becomes overly explanatory because the creators assume you're not paying full attention, that you might have the show on in the background whilst doing other things. But Stranger Things wasn't always like this. Season 1 was tight, focused, and trusted its audience. Characters revealed themselves through action and behaviour, not through monologues about their feelings. The plot moved forward organically, rather than being narrated at you. You had to actually pay attention, and the show rewarded you for doing so. What's particularly frustrating is how this exposition problem destroys any sense of tension or mystery. When characters explain everything they're thinking and planning, there's no room for surprise or discovery. You always know exactly what's going to happen because someone has already told you. The show has become the equivalent of someone explaining a magic trick before performing it. Here's the thing though, the over-explanation is a symptom of a deeper problem, which is that the characters themselves have stopped developing. Despite 10 years of storytelling, most of the main cast feel exactly the same as they did in Season 1, just older. Time magazine's review absolutely nailed this issue, comparing Stranger Things unfavourably to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Both shows are about teens fighting monsters, both use supernatural elements as metaphors for growing up. But Buffy created distinctive characters who evolved and changed over 7 seasons. You got to know them better and better through the struggles that shaped them. Stranger Things, by contrast, has kept its characters broad and bland. That's what happens when you're running a franchise rather than telling a story. Characters become archetypes that can't change too much because you need them to remain recognizable and marketable. It's the Marvel problem applied to a Netflix show. Think about what we actually know about Mike Wheeler beyond the leader. What are his interests besides D&D? What does he want to do with his life? How has he grown or changed since Season 1, beyond getting taller and having a girlfriend? The show has never bothered to develop him into a full person. He's just, quote 31. Lucas has it even worse. He's had so little to do across 5 seasons that he's basically become, quote 32. That's his entire character. In Season 5, he gets maybe 2 significant scenes, and both of them are just him being worried about Max. He has no arc, no development, no personality beyond being the supportive boyfriend. Dustin at least gets to be funny, but that's also his entire character now. He's comic relief. He makes jokes and provides scientific exposition when needed. Remember when he had that whole arc about feeling like an outsider, about struggling to fit in, about his relationship with his mother? None of that matters anymore. He's just there to lighten the mood and explain the science. Will's the most tragic example because he's been a victim for literally the entire series. He starts as the kidnapped kid in Season 1, then he's possessed in Season 2, then he's sidelined in Season 3, then he's pining for Mike in Season 4. In Season 5, he finally gets powers and some agency, But even that feels like too little, too late. We're in the final season, and we still barely know who Will Byers actually is as a person, beyond his trauma and his sexuality. When Will comes out in episode 7, it should be this massive, cathartic moment. But it falls flat partly because Will has never been developed enough as a character for us to feel deeply invested in his personal journey. The show kept him as this cipher, this plot device who things happen to, and then expected us to be emotionally devastated by his coming out scene. You can't have it both ways. The adult characters aren't much better. Joyce and Hopper have been doing the quote my 33 hide you dance for so long that their actual relationship in season 5 feels anticlimactic. We've seen them separate and reunite so many times that there's no emotional weight to them finally being together. It's just, oh, I guess they're a couple now. Nancy and Jonathan's breakup in Volume 2 is particularly poorly handled. They've been together since season 1, and suddenly they're breaking up in a single scene with barely any build-up or explanation. The show needed them apart for plot reasons, so it just happened. No real emotional exploration, no sense of what this relationship has meant to either of them. Just a quick scene and done. Steve's arc has basically been running in place since season 2. He became a good guy, he became a babysitter, he found redemption. Great, but what has he done since then besides pine for Nancy and almost die repeatedly? Season 5 gives him the sex education teacher ending, which is sweet, but it's not earned through any actual character development this season. It's just slapped on in the epilogue. Even 11, who's supposed to be the emotional core of the entire series, feels stagnant. She's still struggling with the same basic questions about her identity and her place in the world that she was grappling with in season 1. There's been no real growth, no evolution. She's more powerful now, sure, but she's not more complex or interesting as a character. The dialogue itself has become almost robotic in its lack of naturalism. People don't talk the way these characters talk. Real teenagers don't sit around articulating their emotional states with the precision of a therapy session. Real people stumble over words, leave things unsaid, communicate through subtext and body language. But stranger things. Season 5 gives us scenes like characters saying, quote 35 quote, or quote 36 quote, or quote 37 quote. It's also on the nose, so devoid of any subtlety or nuance. Every emotion is stated, every theme is announced, every relationship dynamic is verbalized. Compare this to a show like Buffy, which Time magazine rightly points to as a better example. Buffy's characters revealed themselves through how they acted under pressure, through their jokes and fears and contradictions. You learned who they were by watching them navigate impossible situations. Stranger Things just has characters tell you who they are. There's also the problem of having too many storylines and not enough time to do any of them justice. Season 5 is juggling the Hawkins crew, 11's separate storyline, the military presence, Dr. K's pursuit, Holly's journey, Will's powers, the Vecna plot, the Mind Flayer revelation, various romantic subplots, and about a dozen other threads. None of them get the attention they deserve. It's like the Duffers wrote down every idea they had for the final season, and then just shoved all of them into the scripts, without considering whether they actually fit together or had time to breathe. The result is this overstuffed narrative, where nothing feels properly developed and everything feels rushed despite the episodes being 2 hours long. Fun fact, some critics have pointed out that if you removed all the repeated exposition from season 5, you could probably cut the runtime by a third and lose nothing of value. That's how much padding there is, how much unnecessary explanation and redundant dialogue. The writing just feels lazy in a way that earlier seasons never did. It's like the Duffers got tired, or lost interest, or ran out of ideas, and instead of taking the time to craft something special, they just went with the first draft of everything. No polish, no refinement, no attention to the craft of screenwriting, great ideas, terrible execution. That could genuinely be season 5's epitaph. Now you'd think a show with Stranger Things' massive budget would look incredible. And yet here we are, talking about how cheap and artificial Season 5 often appears despite costing more per episode than some feature films. This is what people have started calling the Netflix look, and it's become a genuine problem across multiple shows on the platform. It's this very specific aesthetic where everything is overlit, backgrounds are blurred to hell, green screens are obvious, and nothing feels tangible or real anymore. Season 5 of Stranger Things is absolutely drowning in it. Reddit threads about the show's visual problems were everywhere after Volume 2 dropped. One particularly viral post complained about the overlighting, sets that look fake as hell, and the overuse of depth of field to blur the background on almost every scene and shot. People were properly annoyed that a show this expensive looked like it was filmed on a soundstage with mediocre lighting rather than in actual locations. The lighting is genuinely bizarre throughout the season. Everything is so bright and evenly lit that scenes have no atmosphere or mood. Earlier seasons of Stranger Things were dark, moody, and atmospheric. You felt the creeping dread of the Upside Down, the shadowy corners of Hawkins, the sense of mystery and danger lurking just out of sight. Season 5 looks like it was lit for a sitcom. Even scenes that are supposed to be scary or tense are so brightly illuminated that all the atmosphere evaporates. You can see every detail of every set, every piece of the costume, every bit of makeup. There's no shadow, no mystery, no room for your imagination to fill in the gaps. And don't get me started on the depth of field abuse. For those who don't know, depth of field is when the camera keeps the subject in focus whilst blurring the background. It's a useful tool when deployed strategically, but Season 5 uses it constantly to the point of distraction. Nearly every shot has this aggressively blurred background that makes everything look like it was filmed on a tiny set rather than a real location. The problem with overusing shallow depth of field is that it destroys any sense of space or geography. You can't tell where characters are in relation to each other or their environment because everything beyond 6 feet from the camera is a blurry mess. It's a cheap trick to hide the fact that sets aren't very detailed or expansive, but it just makes everything look cheap and artificial. The green screen work is shockingly poor for a production of this scale. There are multiple scenes where characters are clearly standing in front of a green screen, and the compositing is so obvious that it pulls you right out of the story. You can see the weird glow around their heads, the slightly off colour grading that doesn't quite match the background, the way their hair doesn't move naturally. Season 1 used practical locations and real environments wherever possible. When they did use visual effects, they were integrated carefully and sparingly. Season 5 feels like it was shot almost entirely on sound stages with digital backgrounds, and the lack of real-world texture shows. What's mental about all this is that Netflix clearly spent a fortune on this season. The money went somewhere, but it didn't go into making the show look good. Instead, it seems to have been dumped into expensive CGI creatures and elaborate set pieces that ultimately feel hollow because they're not grounded in anything tangible. Several commenters on Reddit pointed out that other recent shows put Stranger Things to shame visually. HBO's Welcome to Derry was mentioned specifically as having better atmosphere, better lighting, and a more cohesive visual style, despite likely having a smaller budget. Apple TV Plus's For All Mankind was another comparison, with people praising its attention to practical effects and real locations. The thing is, this isn't just a Stranger Things problem. Other Netflix shows suffer from the exact same issues. Emily in Paris was mentioned in the same Reddit threads as having similarly overlit, artificial-looking visuals, despite being a completely different genre. It suggests this is a house style that Netflix is pushing, or at least accepting, across their productions. One theory is that Netflix optimizes their shows for viewing on phones and tablets, where the overlighting and shallow depth of field actually help draw your eye to what's important in the frame. But that's a terrible creative decision if true, because it means sacrificing cinematic quality for mobile viewing convenience. And Stranger Things is supposed to be prestige television, not content you half watch on your phone whilst commuting. There's also a noticeable lack of practical effects in Season 5. Everything is digital. The monsters are CGI, the environments are CGI, even simple things that could have been done practically are rendered in a computer instead. This gives everything a weightless, video game-like quality that undermines the horror. Earlier seasons used practical creature effects and makeup wherever possible, only relying on CGI when absolutely necessary. The Demogorgon in Season 1 was a person in a suit enhanced with digital effects. It felt real and menacing because it was physically present on set with the actors. By Season 5, everything's been replaced with digital creatures that float around without any real sense of mass or presence. I mean, honestly, it's not like practical effects are impossible or prohibitively expensive. Plenty of shows and films still use them to great effect. The problem is that it's often easier and faster to just do everything digitally, especially when you're on a tight production schedule. But easier doesn't mean better, and the show's visual quality has suffered massively as a result. The sets themselves also look cheaper, despite clearly costing more. Hawkins in Season 1 felt like a real small town with history and texture. The locations had character. By Season 5, everything feels like a set. You can see where the walls end, you can tell when something's a facade, and nothing feels lived in or authentic. Part of this is just the nature of the show expanding beyond what can be practically built. When you need massive upside-down environments, or government facilities, or whatever else, you can't just find those locations. You have to build them or create them digitally. But the execution in Season 5 is so poor that the seams show constantly. What's really frustrating is that Stranger Things helped popularize a certain aesthetic when it first came out. That dark, moody, 80s-inspired look with practical effects and real locations became hugely influential. Other shows copied it, and now, in its final season, Stranger Things has abandoned its own visual identity for this generic, overproduced Netflix house style. It looked expensive, just not good. Let's talk about death, or rather, the complete lack of it. One of the most consistent complaints about Season 5, and honestly, one of the most valid, is that the show absolutely refused to kill off any main characters despite spending 8 episodes building up to an apocalyptic final battle. And I mean, the stakes were supposedly higher than ever. The fate of the entire world was hanging in the balance. Vecna was more powerful than he'd ever been. The Upside Down was literally merging with reality, and yet every single core character makes it out alive. Well, except for Carly, but we'll get to her in a moment. This is a show that built its reputation partly on being willing to hurt its characters. Season 1 killed Barb Holland, which became a cultural moment and spawned endless, quote, 39, quote, memes. Season 2 killed Bob Newby, and it was genuinely heartbreaking because we'd grown to love him in just a few episodes. Season 3 killed Billy Hargrove in a redemptive sacrifice that was one of the emotional high points of the series. Season 4 killed Eddie Munson, a brand new character who'd instantly won over the fan base, and his death actually meant something. But Season 5? Nothing. No one dies, at least no one who matters. The show deploys fake-out deaths constantly throughout the season, and after a while, they become laughably transparent. Steve nearly falls from a tower in the finale. There's this moment where he's dangling, losing his grip, and you think, quote, 40, but then he grabs onto something at the last second and pulls himself up. Of course he does, because Stranger Things Season 5 is terrified of actually following through on anything. Hopper gets surrounded by demogorgons at one point, completely overwhelmed, and it looks properly dire. Then 11 shows up in the nick of time to blast them all away. This is the exact same fake-out they pulled in Season 4 when Hopper was supposedly dead in the Russian prison. They've already used this trick. We know he's not actually in danger because the show has cried wolf too many times. 11's sacrifice at the end is meant to be the big, devastating death that justifies the lack of other casualties. She seals herself in the Upside Down to close the rifts permanently, saying goodbye to everyone she loves. It's played as this final tragic moment, except the Duffers immediately undercut it by having Mike theorize that she might not actually be dead, that she could have escaped somehow. So even the one major character who supposedly dies doesn't definitively die. The show wants credit for killing her off without actually committing to it. It's the ultimate example of having your cake and eating it too. The only significant death in the entire finale is Carly 11's quote 41 wire from the season. 2-episode Arcture quote 42. And if you don't remember that episode, you're not alone. It's the most hated episode in the entire series, the one where 11 goes to Chicago and meets a gang of punks with powers. It was widely considered a narrative dead end that the show wisely abandoned after one episode. Carly makes a brief return in season 5 to help 11 rescue the kidnapped children from Camazots, and she dies during that mission. The show treats it as this meaningful sacrifice, but it doesn't land because we barely know her. She appeared in one episode 4 seasons ago, had minimal screen time this season, and now she's gone. Her death carries zero emotional weight. I mean, come on. That's your big death for the final season? A side character from the worst episode of the show? That's what you're offering up as a sacrifice to the gods of narrative stakes. What's really frustrating is how this destroys any sense of tension throughout the season. When you know the show won't actually kill anyone important, all the dangerous situations become hollow. You're not worried when characters face impossible odds because you know they'll somehow make it out. The plot armor is so thick that nothing feels genuinely threatening. Vecna is built up as this terrifying, nearly omnipotent villain. He's killed multiple people on screen. He's orchestrated an apocalypse. He's been the looming threat for 2 full seasons. And in the finale, he gets defeated so quickly and easily that it's almost insulting. Joyce walks up and chops his head off, and that's it. He doesn't take anyone down with him. He doesn't even manage to seriously injure any of the main cast. The Mind Flayer, supposedly the ultimate cosmic horror and the real power behind everything, poses even less of a threat. It's this giant CGI monster that the gang defeats with conventional weapons. It doesn't kill anyone. It barely hurts anyone. For something that's meant to be the most dangerous entity in the Upside Down, it goes down easier than the Demogorgons did in season 1. Speaking of Demogorgons, where the hell were they during the final battle? These creatures have been a consistent threat throughout the entire series. They're fast, deadly, and numerous. The Upside Down is supposed to be crawling with them. But in the finale, they're just completely absent. Vecna and the Mind Flayer show up alone, without any of the monster army we've seen them command for 4 seasons. Fans on social media were properly confused about this. One person asked, where were the Demogorgons, Demobats, and Demodogs? And it's a genuinely good question. Did they all just decide to sit this one out? It makes the final confrontation feel smaller and less consequential than battles we've seen in previous seasons. The military is also portrayed as completely incompetent in the finale, which further reduces the sense of danger. They've been set up all season as this threatening presence hunting 11 and maintaining martial law in Hawkins. In the finale, they just sort of disappear or get easily dealt with. They're not a real obstacle, just an inconvenience. Here's the thing though, the refusal to kill main characters isn't just a season 5 problem, it's been building for a while. After Bob died in season 2, the show became increasingly protective of its core cast. Billy's death in season 3 was impactful, but he was still technically a villain who got a redemption arc. Eddie in season 4 was a new character, not someone we'd spent multiple seasons with. The show has never been willing to kill Mike, Will, Lucas, Dustin, 11, Max, Steve, Nancy, Jonathan, Joyce, or Hopper. These characters have survived impossible situations over and over again, and by season 5, it's become a pattern so obvious that it destroys all tension. To be fair, I understand the impulse. These characters have been with us for a decade. The actors have grown up on screen. there's a parasocial attachment that both the creators and the audience feel. Killing them would be genuinely painful for everyone involved. But great storytelling sometimes requires making difficult choices. Game of Thrones became a cultural phenomenon, partly because it was willing to kill off major characters when the story demanded it. The Walking Dead, for all its later problems, kept stakes high by making you fear for everyone's safety. Even Harry Potter, a children's series, killed beloved characters in its final installment. Stranger Things wanted to be an epic final battle against impossible odds, but it refused to show us any real consequences. It wanted the emotional catharsis of sacrifice without actually sacrificing anything. And the result is a finale that feels safe, sanitized, and stakes-free despite all the apocalyptic trappings. The Duffers have said in interviews that they didn't want to kill characters just for shock value, that every death needs to serve the story. That's a fine philosophy, but the inverse is also true. Sometimes the story demands death, demands loss, demands that characters we love don't make it out. And when you refuse to follow through on that, when you protect everyone with impenetrable plot armor, you're not serving the story either. A show about monsters that refuse to be monstrous. That's season 5 in a nutshell. If writing and stakes were problems, the pacing might have been worse. Season 5 never found its rhythm. It lurches between glacially slow exposition dumps and rushed action sequences, never settling into a comfortable flow that lets the story breathe or build naturally. You're constantly either bored out of your mind or whiplashed by sudden tonal shifts. Episodes 1 and 2 have this problem where they start incredibly slowly. The first 20 minutes of episode 1 are just characters catching up, explaining where everyone's been and re-establishing the status quo. It's necessary information, sure, but it's delivered in the most tedious way possible. People literally sit in rooms and talk at each other whilst the camera slowly pushes in on their faces. Episode 2 does the same thing. It opens with this scene that's meant to be shocking, which it is, but then it immediately slows down to a crawl for the next half hour, whilst everyone processes what happened and discusses what to do about it. The momentum dies instantly. Episode 5 repeats this pattern after the Volume 1 cliffhanger. You'd think they'd come back strong and hit the ground running, but instead, the episode spends ages just setting up new information and moving pieces around the board. It's like watching someone organise their desk instead of actually working. The Roger Ebert review specifically called out how the first episodes of both volumes are the weakest, how the writers slowly build momentum instead of just dropping us into the good stuff. And honestly, for a final season where everyone already knows the characters and the world, there's no excuse for this kind of slow start. You can jump right in. We don't need 30 minutes of preamble before things start happening. But then when action does happen, it feels rushed and undercooked. The final battle that the entire season has been building toward lasts maybe 15 minutes of actual screen time. 15 minutes. After 7 episodes of setup, after hours of characters planning and preparing, the confrontation with Vecna is over in a quarter of an hour. Joyce walks up, chops off his head, and done. The Mind Flayer gets defeated just as quickly. All the creatures are dispatched efficiently. The military is dealt with. The rifts are sealed. Everything wraps up so fast that you don't have time to process what's happening or feel the weight of the moment. It's the exact opposite problem from the rest of the season. We spent so long watching people talk about fighting that when the fighting actually starts, it's over before you've had a chance to get invested in it. And then there's the epilogue, which takes up 40 minutes of the finale's runtime. 40 minutes. That's longer than the entire final battle and resolution combined. I'm not saying the epilogue is bad, actually. It's one of the better parts of the finale. But the ratio is completely off. You can't spend a third of your finale just checking in on where everyone ended up, especially when you've rushed through the actual climax. The time jump itself is also jarring. We go from the immediate aftermath of the battle to 18 months later, with no transition, no breathing room. 1 minute 11 is sealing the rifts. The next we're at a graduation ceremony. The emotional whiplash is real. What's really mental about the pacing is that the episodes are so long and yet so little happens in them. Episode 4 is 81 minutes. Episode 7 is 97 minutes. The finale is over 2 hours. These are feature film runtimes, but they don't feel like complete films because they're padded with so much repetitive dialogue and unnecessary scenes. If you cut all the repeated exposition, all the scenes where characters just stand around talking about things we already know, all the moments that don't advance the plot or develop characters, you could probably trim each episode by 20 to 30 minutes and lose nothing of value. The bloat is extraordinary. Earlier seasons of Stranger Things had much tighter pacing. Episodes were rarely longer than 50 minutes, and every scene felt purposeful. There was forward momentum. Things happened. The story kept moving. Season 5 feels like it's constantly stalling, dragging out every moment beyond what it can sustain. Part of this is probably the Duffers trying to make the final season feel epic and cinematic by making everything longer. But length doesn't equal quality. A tight 45-minute episode that leaves you wanting more is better than a bloated 90-minute episode that leaves you checking how much time is left. The structure of individual scenes is also a problem. Scenes don't know when to end. Characters will have their emotional moment, say what needs to be said, and then the scene just keeps going. They'll repeat themselves, restate what was already clear, or just stand there whilst dramatic music plays. It's like the Duffers forgot that scenes are supposed to have beginnings, middles, and ends. Transitions between storylines are equally clunky. The show will cut from one group of characters to another with no real connection or flow. You're watching Eleven's storyline, then suddenly you're with Steve and Nancy, then you're back to Mike and Will, then you're with Hopper and Joyce. There's no rhythm to it, no sense of how these different threads are building towards something unified. Compare this to Season 1, which juggled multiple storylines brilliantly. You had Joyce looking for Will, Hopper investigating the lab, the boys searching for Eleven, Nancy dealing with Barb's disappearance. All of these threads felt connected and were woven together with real craft. You understood how each piece related to the whole. Season 5 feels like several different shows cut together. The pacing doesn't support the storytelling. The structure works against the narrative. And the runtime is so bloated that what should be exciting feels exhausting instead. Wrong pace at every turn. That's Season 5's pacing in 4 words. Now, I'm not going to lie, it wasn't all bad. I know I've been proper harsh so far, tearing apart nearly every aspect of Season 5. But let's be fair for a moment. There were things that actually worked quite well. Moments where you could see flashes of the brilliance that made Stranger Things special in the first place. Episode 4's battle sequence was genuinely exciting. That 81-minute episode earned its runtime with a properly intense fight that had real energy and stakes, at least in the moment. The choreography was solid, the effects were impressive when they needed to be, and watching all the different characters work together to defend Hawkins actually felt earned. It was Stranger Things firing on all cylinders, delivering the blockbuster spectacle the show had been building toward. Some of the quieter character moments landed beautifully. Hopper's proposal to Joyce at Enzo's, the restaurant they'd been trying to have a date at for literally years, was sweet and well earned. David Harbour and Winona Ryder have genuine chemistry, and watching these two damaged people finally get their moment of happiness after everything they'd been through was lovely. It wasn't revolutionary television, but it was heartfelt and sincere. Will gaining powers connected to the Upside Down was actually a cool development. After spending 4 seasons as a victim, watching him finally have agency and use his connection to Vecna as a weapon rather than a weakness felt satisfying. Noah Schnapp got to do more than just look scared and traumatized, and his scenes confronting Vecna had real emotional weight. Holly Wheeler's storyline was surprisingly engaging. Giving Mike's little sister a major role could have been a disaster, but Nell Fisher did solid work, and the idea of this young girl navigating Vecna's nightmare world whilst learning to see through his illusions was genuinely interesting. It was one of the few truly fresh elements Season 5 introduced. The final Dungeons and Dragons game was emotionally resonant in exactly the way the Duffers intended. Seeing Mike, Will, Lucas, and Dustin back in that basement, back where it all started, playing one last campaign together, hit the nostalgic notes perfectly. It reminded you why you fell in love with these characters in the first place, why their friendship has been the emotional core of the show from day one. Dustin's graduation speech about defying conformity and choosing your own path, whilst obviously meta and a bit on the nose, still worked. Gaten Matarazzo delivered it with the right mix of humour and heart, and the message felt appropriate for a final season about growing up and moving forward while staying true to yourself. The production design, when it wasn't drowning in overlighting and green screen, could still be impressive. The upside-down environments, particularly Camazot's, where the children were being held, had some genuinely creepy and creative visuals. The concept of Vecna's different nightmare dimensions was solid, even if the execution was inconsistent. Millie Bobby Brown's performance as 11 remained strong throughout, even when the writing let her down. She's grown into a genuinely talented actress over the course of the show, and she sold every emotional beat she was given. The moment where 11 says goodbye to Hopper before sealing herself in the Upside Down is heartbreaking, largely because of how much raw emotion Brown brings to it. To be honest, the epilogue worked better than most of the finale that preceded it. Once the show stopped trying to be a blockbuster and just focused on these characters we'd spent a decade with, it remembered what it was good at. Seeing where everyone ended up, watching them move forward with their lives while still carrying the bonds they'd formed, felt like the right emotional note to end on. Steve becoming a teacher is perfect for his character. He spent years being the babysitter, the protector, the guy who looked out for kids who weren't even his responsibility. Having him channel that into an actual career, helping teenagers, makes complete sense and feels like genuine growth. Even some of the more controversial elements had defenders. Plenty of viewers genuinely loved Will's coming out scene and found it moving and important, regardless of the execution issues. For young queer viewers, seeing a character like Will explicitly claim his identity on such a massive show meant something real, and that shouldn't be dismissed just because the writing could have been better. The nostalgia factor worked for a lot of people too. If you grew up with Stranger Things, if these characters have been part of your life for a third of it, then the callbacks and references and moments of, quote, 44 hit differently. The show was speaking directly to people who'd been there from the beginning, and for many of them, that was enough. These moments proved the show could still be great when it wanted to be. The problem is they became increasingly rare, buried under pacing problems and exposition dumps and safe choices. But they were there, scattered throughout the season, like reminders of what Stranger Things used to be consistently, rather than occasionally. And that, my dear friends, is the unfortunate story of how Stranger Things Season 5 became a disaster. To recap what went wrong, we had production troubles from the start with massive delays and rewrites. We had a bizarre release strategy that killed momentum. We had writing that over-explained everything and refused to trust the audience. We had pacing that lurched between glacially slow and rushed. We had a complete absence of stakes because no one important was allowed to die. And we had a finale that played it safe when it should have been bold, leaving major questions unanswered whilst wrapping everything up in a bow that felt unearned. But it wasn't completely unwatchable. There were genuine moments of brilliance scattered throughout, reminders of why we loved this show in the first place. The problem is those moments became exceptions rather than the rule. I've been watching Stranger Things since I was younger, and seeing it end like this is properly gutting. I wanted the Duffers to stick the landing. I wanted that final shot to leave me satisfied, maybe even a bit emotional. Instead, I'm left feeling disappointed and wondering what could have been if they'd made different choices. To be fair, some people genuinely loved Season 5. Not everyone shares these criticisms, and that's completely valid. Art is subjective, and if the finale worked for you, I'm genuinely happy about that. but for many of us, it fell short of what the show deserved. The legacy of Stranger Things isn't ruined by one weak season. Seasons 1 through 4 are still brilliant television that changed the streaming landscape and created a cultural phenomenon. Season 5 is a disappointing end to an otherwise remarkable journey, but it doesn't erase what came before. I'll definitely be covering more Stranger Things content in future videos, including the spin-offs Netflix has planned and whether they can succeed after this finale. There's plenty more to discuss about what this all means for the franchise, but until next time, stay safe and sweet dreams.